You know their names: Zeus, Hera, Athena, Poseidon. You have heard their stories 100 times, in movies, in games, in half-remembered school lessons. But none of those stories are the beginning. Before the gods you know, something else ruled everything, and it was not a god. It was not a hero. It had no face, no voice, no shape. Out of that shapeless thing came monsters so old and so violent that even Zeus, king of Olympus, would not have existed without them. The gods were not first. The monsters were. If you only know the version with the thunderbolts and the golden throne, you are standing in the middle of the story. You skip the part where the universe tore itself apart just to make room for the gods to exist. You skip the part where a father buried his own children alive because he was afraid of what they were. You skip the part where a son cut down his own father in the dark with a weapon his mother built with her bare hands. You skip the part where love itself was born out of that exact wound. This is the story the Greeks told before they told any other story. It comes from a poet named Hesiod, writing around 700 years before the Common Era in a work called the Theogony, which simply means the birth of the gods. And what he described was not a family tree hanging quietly on a wall. It was a war that never really ended. It only changed which generation was doing the killing. Let's start where he started, before there were parents, before there was even a place to stand. In the beginning, there was chaos. Not chaos the way you use the word today. Not noise, not disorder, not a messy desk or a chaotic morning. The old Greek word meant something closer to a gap, a yawning emptiness, an open mouth in the void with nothing inside it. There was no ground beneath anything. There was no sky above anything. There was no up or down, because up and down had not been invented yet. There was only the gap, stretching in every direction, holding nothing, going nowhere, waiting for something to fill it without knowing that waiting was even happening. Try to picture that for a moment. Not darkness, because darkness needs light to be the absence of. Not silence, because silence needs sound to be the absence of. Just a gap, a wound in nothing, with nothing on either side of it to close. No before, no after, just the gap itself, older than time, because time had not started yet either. And somehow, out of that gap, the first things came into being, one after another, with no explanation given for why or how, because Hesiod was not trying to explain physics. He was trying to explain why the world felt the way it felt, and that meant starting with an admission that nobody actually knows what came before the beginning. Gaia arrived, the earth herself, wide and deep and solid, the very first firm thing that had ever existed anywhere. Tartarus arrived, a pit so far below the earth that if you dropped a bronze anvil from the surface, it would fall for 9 full days and 9 full nights before it ever hit bottom. Think about that measurement for a second. The Greeks did not say deep, they gave you a number, 9 days of falling, because a number is harder to shrug off than an adjective. And Eros arrived, the force of desire and joining, the pull that makes separate things want to become one thing. Not romance in the way you picture roses and candlelight. A raw, gravitational hunger, older than any love story ever told. The force that made the rest of creation possible at all. Because without something pulling separate pieces together, everything chaos produced would have simply drifted apart forever. Alone, never touching, never becoming anything more than scattered fragments. Chaos itself, before it produced Gaia and the others, also gave rise to 2 children directly, on its own, without needing a partner at all. Erebus, the personification of primordial darkness, thick enough to hold its own shape, older than shadow itself, and Nyx, the night. Pay close attention to Nyx, because she matters more than most retellings ever admit. And what she does next tells you almost everything you need to know about how this universe actually works underneath its surface. Nyx and Erebus joined, in that raw Eros-driven way, and produced ether, the bright upper air the gods would one day breathe far above the clouds, and Hemera, the day itself, golden and clear, light, born from darkness. Read that twice. That alone should tell you something about how this universe works. Nothing in this story arrives clean. Everything is born out of something that looks, at first glance, like its exact opposite. But Nyx did not stop there. Later poets described her alone, without any partner at all, producing an entire brood of children by herself, out of nothing but her own nature. And this list is where the myth stops sounding like a gentle bedtime story and starts sounding like a diagnosis of existence itself, written down 3,000 years before anyone had a word for psychology. She birthed Thanatos, death, quiet and inevitable. She birthed Hypnos, sleep, his twin brother, because the Greeks understood something we still repeat in our own language without thinking about it, that sleep and death are close cousins. Born from the same womb, wearing different faces, she birthed the Moirai, the Fates, 3 sisters who spin, measure, and cut the thread of every single mortal life, deciding in advance how long you get before Thanatos comes to collect you. She birthed Nemesis, righteous retribution, the force that made certain no one who rose too high in pride ever stayed there without eventually paying for it. She birthed Eris, discord itself, whose single golden apple would, generations later, start the entire Trojan War over one afternoon of jealousy. She birthed Momus, blame and mockery, always ready to point at someone else's failure. She birthed the Charis, spirits of violent death, the ones who were said to hover just above battlefields, waiting. She birthed Oises, misery and apate, deceit and Garrus, old age, slow and unwelcome, and Charon, the ferryman who would carry every single soul across the river into the underworld, one coin at a time, forever. Read that list again, slowly. Death, sleep, fate, vengeance, discord, blame, violent death, misery, deceit, old age, the ferryman to the underworld. That is not a family tree hanging on someone's wall. That is an inventory of every hard truth a human being will ever face in an entire lifetime, and the Greeks placed every single one of them at the very beginning of everything, born from the night, before the earth had even finished cooling, before a single god had been crowned, before there was a Zeus to blame anything on. Death, deceit, and old age were already waiting in the dark, patiently, long before anyone existed who could suffer from them. That is the first thing this myth is trying to tell you. The hard parts of existence are not a punishment added later, tacked on after some earlier, gentler version of the world went wrong. They are original equipment. They came bundled with the universe on day one, wrapped in the same darkness that gave us daylight. Now, back to Gaia, standing alone on a world that still had no sky above it. The Earth needed a partner, so she brought one into being from within herself, without needing anyone else at all, an act of creation that belonged entirely to her. Oranos, the sky, stretched himself out to cover her completely, mountain range to mountain range, horizon to horizon, becoming the solid dome that would hold up everything above the ground for the rest of the story. And Gaia and Oranos, earth and sky, became the first true parents in this account, the first two beings who came together the way we still understand family today. Together, they had children. 12 of them, enormous beings called the Titans, 6 sons and 6 daughters, and each one of them was not simply a background character waiting for Zeus to arrive. Each one already represented something enormous about the shape of the coming world. Oceanus, the endless river that would circle the entire world like a belt, older than any sea that came after him. Hyperion, the light that watches from above, father of the sun and the moon and the dawn before those things had their own separate names. Themis, whose very name means divine law, order that existed before a single court, a single ruler, or a single written rule had ever been needed. Mnemosyne, whose name simply means memory, existing as a titan in her own right, which tells you something remarkable, that the Greeks believed memory itself was old enough to predate civilization, old enough to predate cities, old enough to predate even the gods who would one day be remembered, and Cronus, the youngest of the 12, and, as you are about to learn, by far the most dangerous. Order existed before anyone had broken a law. Memory existed before anyone had a history worth remembering. Notice that. The Titans were not simply strong. Several of them were the very ideas that would make civilization possible in the first place, existing quietly in the background for generations before a single human being would ever need them. But Gaia and Ouranos had other children too, and this is where the story stops feeling like a family portrait and starts feeling like something much closer to a horror story. 3 of their children were Cyclopes, one-eyed giants of enormous strength, master craftsmen whose skill with fire and metal was unmatched by anything else in creation, beings who would one day forge Zeus's thunderbolt itself, the single most famous weapon in all of Greek myth. And 3 more were the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones, beings so overwhelming that each one had 50 heads and 100 arms growing from their shoulders, beings so far outside ordinary shape that no sculptor of the ancient world ever seriously tried to carve one. Picture that for a second, and really try to hold the image steady. Not a monster in a rubber costume from an old film, 100 arms, 50 faces, all looking in different directions at once. A living creature built on a scale that should not have been physically possible, born from the exact same union that produced the graceful human-shaped titans standing right beside them. And Ouranos, the sky itself, looked at these children, his own children, and felt something that would define the rest of this entire story, and honestly, define most of what comes after it in Greek myth for generations to come. He felt afraid. Not afraid of an enemy from outside, not afraid of a rival god from some other corner of creation, afraid of his own sons. He looked at the 100 arms, the 50 heads, the raw and monstrous strength of the Hecatoncheires and the Cyclopes standing before him, and he decided they simply could not be allowed to exist in the world he ruled. So he did the one thing a father in a position of absolute unquestioned power can do to children he fears and cannot control. He buried them. He shoved them back down into Gaia's own body, deep inside the earth, into Tartarus itself, that same pit 9 days deep, and sealed them there, alive, hidden, out of sight, out of mind, but never actually gone, never destroyed, just buried, breathing, waiting in the dark. Now think carefully about what that means from Gaia's side of things. She is the earth. These children are physically inside her, trapped inside her own body by the very partner who helped create them in the first place, and she can feel every single moment of their imprisonment, because they are not somewhere far away. They are inside her, every hour, every day, for what the story implies was an unbearably long stretch of time. The weight of it became unbearable. Ancient sources describe her groaning under the strain, in genuine physical pain from carrying her own buried children inside her, permanently, with no end in sight. And pain, when it goes on long enough with absolutely no relief anywhere on the horizon, eventually stops being simple suffering and turns into something else entirely. It turns into a plan. Gaia reached into herself and produced a new substance, a gray metal called adamant, harder than anything that had existed up to that point in the story, and she shaped it into a massive sickle, curved and sharp enough, the old texts imply, to cut through anything at all, even the very fabric that held sky and earth locked together. Then she turned to her other children, the 12 titans still free and unburied, still walking in the light instead of buried in the dark. And she asked them a question that should chill you slightly every single time you hear it, because it might be one of the oldest questions in all of human storytelling. Which of you will help me punish your father? 11 of them said nothing. 11 of them looked away, out of loyalty or fear, or simple, quiet self-preservation. and refused to move a single step against Ouranos. Only one stepped forward out of the silence, the youngest of the 12, Cronus. He took the sickle from his mother's hands, feeling its weight for the first time, and Gaia hid him in ambush at the edge of the world, in the deep shadow at the border where sky met earth. And that night, when Ouranos came down to lie with Gaia, exactly as he always had, expecting nothing, suspecting nothing, Cronus reached out from the darkness where his mother had hidden him and struck. The wound was not small, and it was not gentle in any symbolic sense you might be picturing. Ouranos was castrated by his own son, in an act of violence so total and so complete that it physically separated the sky from the earth for the very first time in the entire history of the universe. Before that single moment, sky and earth had been locked together, pressed against each other with no room to breathe between them. After it, there was distance for the first time. There was a gap between heaven and ground, and everything that would ever exist inside that gap, weather, birds, the open air itself, every sunrise that has ever happened since, only became possible because of one single act of violent rebellion against a father, carried out in the dark. Cronus threw what he had cut away behind him into the sea, and this is where the story does something the Greeks were unusually gifted at, taking an act of extreme, brutal violence and folding real beauty directly out of it, without ever pretending the violence underneath had not happened. Where it struck the water, sea foam gathered and churned around it, and from that foam a goddess rose, fully formed, walking calmly onto the shore of the island of Cyprus, as though nothing at all had happened moments before. Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty itself, born not from a peaceful union between two willing partners, but from the severed remains of a father's punishment, carried on the very waves his own son had thrown him into. Sit with that pairing for a moment, because it deserves more than a passing thought. Love, in this story, is not presented as the gentle opposite of violence. It is one of its most direct byproducts. It comes out of the exact same wound, rising from the same water that had just swallowed an act of total betrayal. And Aphrodite was not the only thing born from that spilled blood. Where the drops struck the earth itself, Gaia absorbed them into her own body, and from them came the Erinyes, the Furies, terrifying spirits of vengeance, whose entire purpose in the world from that day forward would be to hunt down anyone who ever committed violence against their own family. Think carefully about the layering happening here. The very first act of violence between a parent and a child in the entire mythology directly produced the beings whose eternal job would be punishing exactly that kind of violence, forever, in every generation that followed after it. The crime created its own police force in the very same instant it was committed, as though the universe itself refused to let that kind of betrayal go unanswered ever again. The same blood also produced giants, enormous, warlike beings who would later rise up in open rebellion against the Olympian gods themselves in a war of their own, generations further down the line. And it produced the Meliae, gentle nymphs of the ash trees, quiet and soft-spoken, born from the exact same violent moment as the screaming Furies and the war-hungry giants. So take a breath and actually count what came pouring out of one single act. A father's cruelty toward his own children, a mother's decades of buried silent pain, a son's blade in the dark at his mother's request. And from that one collapse, in a single instant, love itself, in the form of Aphrodite rising from the foam, vengeance itself, in the form of the Furies rising from the earth, war itself, in the form of the giants, and gentleness itself, in the form of the quiet ash tree nymphs standing beside them. Nearly everything that would come to define human experience for the rest of history came pouring out of a single act of generational violence, not metaphorically, in some loose poetic sense. In the actual, literal structure of this myth, that is exactly where these forces are said to come from. Ouranos was gone from power, driven out, wounded, no longer able to rule. Cronus took the throne in his place, and for a while it must have felt to everyone watching like the story was finally mercifully over. The tyrant had been overthrown. The buried children were still buried, yes, still down in Tartarus, but the cruel father who put them there was gone. The worst part seemed to be behind them. Except Cronus married his own sister Rhea, one of the 12 Titans, and together they began to have children of their own, one after another. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, and eventually, waiting to be born, the youngest. And here the story does something that should genuinely unsettle you far more than the first betrayal did, because it does not introduce a brand new problem for this generation to face. It repeats the exact same one, almost word for word, one generation later, as if the universe itself could not imagine any other way for power to behave. Cronus received a prophecy, passed down through Gaia and Uranus both, warning him clearly that one of his own children was destined to overthrow him, exactly the way he himself had once overthrown his own father with a sickle in the dark. He did not build a wall to protect himself. He did not send his children away to somewhere safe and distant. He did not try to change his fate through wisdom, or diplomacy, or even simple kindness. He did the only thing he had ever personally learned that a father in absolute power could do when faced with a child who might one day threaten him. As each of his children was born, he swallowed them, whole, alive, one after another, without hesitation. Hestia first, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon, each one disappearing down his throat the moment they took their first breath, trapped inside their own father's body. Exactly the way the Cyclopes and the Hecaton shares had once been trapped inside the body of Gaia generations earlier. The exact same horror, passed down like a family inheritance nobody ever chose to break. Ouranos buried his frightening children inside the earth. Cronus swallowed his frightening children inside himself. Different method, identical fear underneath it, identical solution every single time. A parent holding absolute power, faced with the possibility of one day being replaced, choosing imprisonment over trust, generation after generation, as though no other option had ever occurred to either of them. Rhea could not bear to lose another child to her husband's fear, and when she found herself pregnant with her sixth, she went to Gaia, the very same grandmother who had once armed Cronus against his own father, and asked her for help one more time. Gaia gave her a plan. When the sixth child was born, Rhea hid him away in secret on the island of Crete, far from his father's reach, and in his place she wrapped a large stone in swaddling cloth and handed the bundle to Cronus as though nothing were wrong. Cronus, expecting a child exactly like all the others, swallowed the stone whole without ever checking closely, and felt satisfied, once again, that the threat had been dealt with permanently. That child, the one hidden away on Crete while his father sat on his throne quietly digesting a rock, was Zeus. And this is exactly where we could stop, because you already know the broad shape of what happens after this part. You know Zeus grows up in hiding. You know he eventually returns to challenge his father directly. You know he forces Cronus to bring his siblings back up, one by one, fully grown, ready to stand and fight beside him against the very man who swallowed them as infants. But before we get there, look at what Zeus actually chooses to do differently, because it is the one genuinely new decision in this entire chain of repeated fear. When the war finally comes, the Titanomachy, 10 brutal years of Titans against Olympians, mountains ripped up and hurled like stones, the very sky reportedly shaking with the violence of it. Zeus does something none of his ancestors ever considered. He goes down into Tartarus himself, into that same pit 9 days deep, and he frees the ones who have been buried there the longest. The Cyclopes, still down there after everything, still remembering exactly who put them there and why. And the Hecatoncares, 100 arms each, 50 heads each, still trapped in the exact same darkness Ouranos had sealed them into at the very beginning of this entire story. Zeus does not fear them the way his grandfather once did. He arms them. The Cyclopes forge him his thunderbolt, the weapon that will define him for the rest of mythology. The hundred-handed ones step out of Tartarus and into the war itself, each one hurling not one boulder at a time, but handfuls of them, dozens at once, turning the tide of a 10-year stalemate in what the old sources describe as a matter of days. The very monsters that 2 generations of fearful fathers tried to erase from existence are the exact reason the Olympians win the war at all. Everything Ouranos buried out of fear becomes, in the hands of his great-grandson, the deciding weapon of the entire conflict. Sit with that for a second, because it changes how you should read everything that came before it. Zeus does not break the pattern of fear entirely. He still overthrows his own father, the same way his father overthrew his own father before him. But he breaks one small, crucial piece of it. He does not bury what frightens him. He reaches for it, arms it, and lets it fight beside him instead of rotting in the dark. It is the only moment in this entire lineage where fear is answered with trust instead of another burial, and it is exactly the moment that decides who wins. Even that, though, is not the end of the pattern completely, because Zeus goes on to swallow one of his own partners later in the wider mythology, afraid of a prophecy that her child might one day surpass him. An echo of his father and his grandfather that even the supposed hero of this story never fully escapes. The pattern bends, it does not break. So here is the real question underneath all of this. The one Hesiod was quietly asking 27 centuries ago in a small town in Greece, dictating verses about a war between fathers and sons that never seemed to actually end. If the gods themselves, the ones who supposedly represent order, justice, and civilization, were born out of buried monsters, a castrated father, a line of swallowed children, and a fear that repeated itself generation after generation, almost without exception, then what does that say about power itself? Not myth, not fantasy. Power, as an idea, is it ever inherited cleanly? Or does every throne in every story we tell sit on top of something that someone, at some point, tried very hard to bury? The Greeks did not answer that question directly for you. They just kept telling the story, generation after generation, letting each new audience sit with the same quiet discomfort Hesiod clearly wanted them to feel, without ever softening it into something easier to swallow. Maybe that discomfort is the actual point of the whole thing. Maybe the reason this myth has survived for nearly 3,000 years is not because it neatly explains where the gods came from. Maybe it survived because it explains something uncomfortable about us, about the people who kept choosing generation after generation to sit around and tell it anyway. If you have made it this far, you already understand this is not a channel interested in easy, comfortable answers. If that is your kind of thing, subscribe, and I will keep bringing you the stories hiding underneath the stories you already thought you knew completely. And before you go, sit with this for one more moment. Somewhere beneath the ground you are standing on right now, in the version of this myth the Greeks genuinely believed, the hundred-handed ones spent generations buried in the dark before anyone ever came looking for them. Freed, eventually, yes, and even celebrated as heroes of the final war. But only after generation of darkness first, with no one checking, no one asking, no one wondering whether the fear that put them there had ever actually been justified in the first place. Ask yourself, what is buried beneath the things you were simply taught to accept without question? You might be genuinely surprised at how much is still down there, waiting quietly for someone to finally go looking.